Dr. Elena Vasquez had seen boardrooms designed to intimidate before, but this one achieved new heights of architectural condescension. The chamber stretched upward like a crystalline cathedral, its walls pulsing with bioluminescent data streams that hurt to look at directly. 3 beings sat across from her at a table that seemed to have grown from the floor itself, each representing a different approach to looking down on lesser species. The Keth representative resembled a praying mantis crossed with a quantum computer, its multifaceted eyes processing information faster than Eleanor could blink. Beside it, the Vorlian delegate looked like someone had taught a tree to wear a business suit and develop opinions about military spending. The third creature defied easy description. Imagine if mathematics had achieved consciousness and decided to become insufferably smug about it. "Dr. Vasquez," the Keth began, its voice a harmonious blend of clicking and electronic whirring, "we appreciate your willingness to consult on our current difficulties with the Devourer incursion." Elena sipped her coffee from a ceramic mug she'd brought from Earth, noting how the aliens reacted to the primitive drinking vessel like she'd pulled out a stone axe. "Your difficulties, right. 18 months of getting your asses handed to you by an enemy you can't identify, predict, or effectively engage. Those difficulties?" The tree thing rustled disapprovingly. The Vorlian collective prefers more diplomatic terminology when discussing strategic setbacks. "And I prefer enemies that don't systematically dismantle 300-year-old military doctrines like they're following a how-to guide. But we don't always get what we want." Eleanor set down her mug with deliberate casualness. "So let's skip the diplomatic terminology and talk about why your quantum predictive algorithms keep getting outmaneuvered by an opponent that shouldn't exist." The mathematical entity spoke for the first time, its voice a perfect sine wave that somehow conveyed disdain. "The Zarathi synthesis has computed 14,729 potential tactical responses to Devourer aggression. Each simulation indicates a 73.2% probability of successful engagement. And yet here you are, hiring a human because your computers can't figure out why you keep losing." Elena leaned back in her chair, which had apparently been designed for beings with entirely different spines. "Tell me, in all those simulations, did you account for the possibility that your enemy might not be playing by the same rules?" The Keth's eyes shifted through several spectrums of light. "Our combat algorithms incorporate all known variables of interstellar warfare: logistics, fleet positioning, resource allocation, technological advantages." "Psychological warfare?" Silence. Elena waited, letting the question hang in the air like smoke from a battlefield. The aliens exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among beings who communicated partially through pheromones and electromagnetic frequencies. The Vorlian military philosophy emphasizes efficiency and resource optimization, the tree creature finally offered. Psychological manipulation is considered wasteful. "Wasteful," Elena repeated the word like she was tasting something bitter. "The Devourers have destroyed or captured 17 of your star systems using what you call wasteful tactics. They've turned 3 of your colonies into refugee camps and made your admiralty so paranoid they're seeing enemy ships in their sleep. But sure, psychological warfare is wasteful?" The Zarathi entity's form flickered slightly, probably the equivalent of a nervous tick. "Human military history is replete with inefficient emotional responses to combat scenarios. We have evolved beyond such primitive reactive patterns." Eleanor pulled out a tablet, another quaint human device that made the aliens shift uncomfortably, and scrolled through files. "I've been reading your classified battle reports. Fascinating stuff. The Devourers never attack where your models predict. They ignore strategically valuable targets in favor of seemingly random objectives. They use outdated technology, but somehow coordinated more effectively than your quantum-linked fleet. The unpredictability factor has been challenging to quantify, the Kess admitted. Unpredictability isn't a factor, it's a weapon. Elena stood and walked to the holographic display dominating one wall. The star map showed Devara incursions in red, a spreading infection across previously secure space. Look at the pattern, really look at it. The aliens joined her, their various sensory organs focused on the display. Elena traced the advancement routes with her finger, leaving brief thermal signatures on the haptic interface. They're not conquering territory, she continued. They're sending a message. Every target they hit was chosen to maximize psychological impact on your remaining forces. The colony ships weren't destroyed for their resources. They were crippled and left drifting, so you'd have to mount expensive rescue operations. The research stations weren't looted for technology. They were left intact but contaminated, forcing you to quarantine valuable facilities. The Volian's bark-like skin darkened. You suggest they wage war through intimidation rather than tactical superiority. I'm suggesting they understand something about warfare that your simulations don't account for. Elena turned back toward the table, noting how the aliens instinctively stepped back from her movement. Fear is a force multiplier. Uncertainty degrades decision-making. Demoralization destroys unit cohesion faster than any weapon. Such concepts are antithetical to rational military planning, the Zorothi declared. Elena laughed, a sound that seemed to physically pain her audience. Rational military planning? You want to know what's rational? Winning. Everything else is philosophy. She returned to her seat and picked up her coffee mug again. Your enemy has been playing psychological warfare for 18 months, and you've been responding with spreadsheets. The Keth's eyes cycled through another spectrum shift. What do you recommend? First, I need to understand exactly how they think. Every battle report, every tactical analysis, every communication intercept. Second, you need to accept that efficiency isn't always effective. Sometimes the best strategy looks like chaos from the outside. The Volian Collective cannot authorize release of classified strategic data to an external consultant, the Treebeam protested. Elena drained her coffee and stood. Then the Volian Collective can continue losing to an enemy that treats your rational military planning like a predictable algorithm. She gathered her tablet and headed toward the door. Your choice, give me the data, or keep wondering why your quantum computers can't solve analog problems. Dr. Vasquez, the Keth called after her. If we provide this information, what assurance do we have that you can succeed where our systems have failed? Elena paused at the threshold, not turning around. Because your enemy isn't using technology to beat you. They're using psychology. And psychology is what humans do best. The door sealed behind her with a soft hiss, leaving 3 of the galaxy's most advanced intelligences to contemplate the uncomfortable possibility that warfare might not be as civilized as they'd believed. 3 hours later, Elena stood before a wall of holographic displays that would have made Earth's most advanced war rooms look like finger paintings. The aliens had capitulated faster than she'd expected, apparently losing another colony while debating data access protocols had a wonderfully clarifying effect on bureaucratic priorities. Before we begin, Elena announced to her audience of reluctant students, I need you to understand that everything I'm about to show you will violate your fundamental assumptions about civilized behavior. She gestured at the first display, which materialized a topographical map of ancient Carthage. This is how humans learned to think about war. The Keth tilted its insectoid head. Carthage was destroyed over 2 millennia ago. Historical precedent seems irrelevant to contemporary stellar conflict. Carthage was destroyed because one man understood that armies don't just fight with weapons, they fight with minds. The map shifted, showing a route across mountain ranges that should have been impassable. Hannibal Barca took war elephants over the Alps in winter, not because it was efficient, but because it was impossible. The Romans spent so much time calculating why he couldn't do it, that they never prepared for what would happen when he did. The Vaulians' branches swayed with agitation. Sacrificing resources for theatrical gestures contradicts optimal strategic thinking. Eleanor smiled with the patience of someone explaining fire to beings made of kindling. Optimal strategic thinking assumed your enemy would behave rationally. Hannibal's entire strategy was to make the Romans so afraid of him that they'd defeat themselves through paranoia and overreaction. It worked for 16 years. He dismissed Carthage and summoned a new display showing ancient Chinese terrain. Sun Tzu wrote that supreme excellence consists of breaking the enemy's resistance without fighting. He understood that the greatest victory is the one where your opponent surrenders before the battle begins. Surrender implies the acceptance of inferior positioning. The Zarathi interjected, its mathematical consciousness apparently struggling with the concept. Rational beings do not surrender when tactical analysis indicates potential for success. Rational beings, Elena repeated slowly, don't exist in a vacuum. They exist in a universe where their children might die, where their homes might burn, where their leaders might be incompetent or corrupt, or simply unlucky. She expanded the display to show troop movements that seemed to follow no logical pattern. Sun Tzu's armies won by making their enemies believe victory was impossible, even when it wasn't. The aliens absorbed this information with visible discomfort. The Keth's optical arrays dimmed slightly, while the Vaulians' bark developed stress fractures. Only the Zarathi remained outwardly unchanged, though its form flickered more rapidly. Elena advanced to her next example, a grainy black and white photograph of tanks rolling through European countryside. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. The Germans didn't win because they had better tanks. They won because they moved faster than their enemies could think. Speed is a quantifiable tactical advantage, the Vaulian observed, apparently grasping for familiar concepts. Speed of thought, not speed of movement. Elena zoomed in on Wehrmacht communications equipment. They coordinated attacks using radio technology the Allies also possessed. The difference was doctrinal. German commanders were trained to exploit confusion and maintain pressure even when their original plans fell apart. Their enemies kept trying to restore order, while the Germans kept creating chaos. The Keth's mandibles clicked in what might have been distress. You describe warfare as the systematic destruction of logical decision-making processes. Now you're getting it. Elena dismissed the historical displays and called up the Devourer battle reports. Look at these engagements again, but this time stop thinking like military analysts and start thinking like predators. The data streams showed the same spreading infection of red markers, but now Elena highlighted specific tactical choices that had previously seemed random. Tarnova Station wasn't attacked because of its strategic value. It was attacked because its destruction would force you to redeploy 3 fleet groups to protect similar installations. The Kepler colony wasn't occupied for its resources. It was turned into a broadcasting station that transmits surrender demands across 17 star systems. The Vaulians' distress was now visibly spreading through its root system. They weaponize our own protective instincts against us. They understand that every rational response you make creates new vulnerabilities they can exploit. Elena pulled up casualty reports that made even the emotionless Zarathi flicker erratically. You've been fighting them like they're a military force. They've been treating you like a psychological experiment. This paradigm suggests our enemy possesses intimate knowledge of cognitive manipulation techniques, the Keth observed, its voice carrying overtones of something that might have been fear. Elena nodded grimly. More than that, they're using these techniques with a sophistication that suggests formal training in human military doctrine. She paused, studying the data patterns with growing recognition. Show me your complete strategic database. Every tactical manual, every theoretical framework, every academic paper on asymmetric warfare you've collected. The three aliens exchanged another round of complex communications. Electromagnetic frequencies, chemical signals, and quantum entanglement pulses that created a symphony of worried consultation. Such information represents centuries of accumulated military knowledge. The Zarathi finally responded. Access requires unanimous authorization from the Triumvirate Defense Council. Then get unanimous authorization, because I think I know why your enemy fights like a human. Elena's expression had shifted from professional confidence to something approaching alarm. And if I'm right, you've been fighting ghosts this entire time. The boardroom's environmental systems hummed more loudly, compensating for the elevated stress responses of three species simultaneously confronting the possibility that their rational universe might be neither rational nor safe. Outside the crystalline walls, stars continued their ancient dance, oblivious to the organic and digital intelligences below, struggling to comprehend warfare as emotional manipulation rather than technological superiority. The strategic database materialized around Elena like a three-dimensional library constructed from pure information. Academic papers, tactical manuals, and theoretical frameworks stretched in all directions, each document tagged with acquisition dates, source identifications, and cross-referenced applications. The aliens watched nervously as she navigated through decades of accumulated military scholarship with the fluid movements of someone who'd spent years in similar archives. "Remarkable collection," Elena murmured, her fingers dancing through holographic filing systems. Cambridge University's Strategic Studies program, the Prussian Staff College archives, even some classified Pentagon documents from the resource wars. She paused at a familiar interface layout. "You've been collecting human military theory for 30 years. The Galactic Academic Exchange Protocol requires member species to share educational resources," the Vorlian explained defensively. "Human institutions were surprisingly cooperative in providing historical military studies." Elena's search parameters narrowed, focusing on papers published between specific dates. Her expression grew increasingly tense as she recognized formatting styles, citation methods, and theoretical frameworks that triggered uncomfortable memories of late-night research sessions and academic peer reviews. Dr. Marcus Webb's analysis of unconventional force multiplication, Professor Chen's dissertation on resource denial strategies in asymmetric conflicts. Elena's voice carried a note of professional recognition mixed with growing unease. "These are good papers, solid theoretical work with practical application." The Keth observed her mounting agitation with clinical interest. "You appear familiar with these human academic sources." "I should be." Elena's fingers stopped moving through the database, her attention fixed on a cluster of documents that shared common authorship tags. "I helped develop half the concepts they're citing." She isolated a specific paper, expanding it to fill the display space around them. The title read, "Psychological Leverage in Multi-Theater Asymmetric Warfare, a Framework for Converting Enemy Strengths into Strategic Vulnerabilities." The author line showed Dr. Elena M. Vasquez, submitted to the Journal of Advanced Strategic Studies 15 years prior. "This is my doctoral thesis." The silence that followed was profound enough to register on the room's acoustic sensors. Even the environmental system seemed to quiet, as if the machinery itself recognized the weight of the revelation. Your theoretical work was submitted through standard academic exchange protocols, the Zorathi stated, though its form flickered with what might have been embarrassment. All participating institutions agreed to share research findings for the advancement of galactic knowledge. Eleanor scrolled through the paper, recognizing her own arguments, her own case studies, her own recommendations for exploiting psychological weaknesses in technologically superior opponents. Did anyone bother reading the conclusion section? The part where I specifically warned about the dangers of applying these theories without understanding their ethical implications. She highlighted a passage that glowed ominously in the holographic space. The strategies outlined in this framework represent humanity's accumulated experience in survival-based warfare. Their application should be considered only in contexts where conventional military doctrine has proven inadequate, and never without careful consideration of long-term psychological consequences for both implementer and target populations. The Devourers have been using my own work to destroy you, Elena continued, her voice carrying a mixture of professional pride and personal horror. Every tactic they've employed, every psychological pressure point they've exploited, every method of turning your strengths against you. I wrote the instruction manual. The Vorlian's branches rustled with distress. The implications suggest deliberate misappropriation of academic research for hostile purposes. Worse than that, Elena expanded her search, pulling up additional papers that referenced her work. Look at the citation patterns. Someone didn't just read my thesis. They studied everything I've ever published, cross-referenced it with classical military theory, and adapted it specifically for use against species with your psychological profiles. The database revealed a comprehensive collection of Elena's academic output. Papers on cultural warfare, studies on technological overconfidence as a strategic weakness, analyses of how highly rational societies respond to irrational threats. Someone had assembled a complete curriculum in Vasquez-style military psychology. The acquisition dates, the Keth observed, its optical arrays focusing on temporal metadata. These documents were accessed repeatedly over the past 2 years, with intensive study periods corresponding directly to Devourer offensive operations. Elena felt the cold recognition settle in her stomach like a stone. They've been doing homework. Every engagement was a field test of theoretical concepts I developed in graduate school. She pulled up battle reports and overlaid them with passages from her own writing, watching as tactical implementations aligned perfectly with academic recommendations. The Kepler colony broadcast strategy matches your analysis of demoralization through information warfare, the Zorathi noted, its mathematical consciousness apparently finding the correlation patterns fascinating despite their implications. The Tarnova station attack precisely follows your recommended approach for forcing resource reallocation through targeted infrastructure disruption. It's not just my work, Eleanor realized, expanding her search to encompass related academic sources. They've built an entire military doctrine around human psychological warfare theory, Webb's force multiplication, Chen's resource denial, Thompson's work on technological asymmetry. Someone created a graduate-level curriculum in human military thinking. The aliens processed this information with the efficiency of beings accustomed to rapid strategic recalculation. Their enemy wasn't simply unpredictable. It was systematically educated in the art of human warfare, trained in techniques specifically designed to exploit the weaknesses of rational, technologically advanced civilization. The question now, Elena said, closing the displays and turning to face her alien audience. is whether they've also studied the weaknesses I built into these theories. Weaknesses? The Vorlian inquired. Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut titanium. I'm not stupid enough to publish a complete guide to defeating superior enemies without including some insurance. Every strategy I've ever written has a built-in failure point, a psychological pressure that turns the entire framework against itself. She gestured toward the data streams still flowing around them, representing 18 months of military defeats and strategic humiliation. Your enemy learned to think like humans by studying our academic work, but they never learned to think like me. Eleanor had commandeered the Triumvirate's primary tactical center, transforming their pristine command facility into something resembling a human war room, complete with coffee stains on holographic interfaces and the persistent hum of over-caffeinated strategic planning. The change in atmosphere was palpable. Where once sterile efficiency had reigned, now organized chaos held court. The fundamental flaw in my published theories, Elena explained to the assembled fleet commanders, is that they assume the implementer understands the difference between strategy and obsession. She highlighted specific sections of her doctoral work that glowed like warning beacons in the holographic display. Human psychological warfare works because humans know when to stop. We understand that breaking their capacity to think. Admiral Thexara, a Keth military commander whose career spanned 3 centuries, rotated its compound eyes toward Elena. The Devourers demonstrate no such restraint in their psychological applications. Exactly. Elena pulled up real-time intelligence feeds showing Devourer fleet movements. They've been following my theoretical frameworks like religious doctrine, instead of treating them as adaptive guidelines. Look at their deployment patterns over the past 6 months. They're repeating successful psychological tactics, even when the strategic situation has changed. Commander Yiroloth, representing the Vorlian military hierarchy, extended sensory fronds toward the data streams. Their predictability increases as their confidence in human-directed strategies grows. Which brings us to the trap I've been setting for 18 months without realizing it. Elena's expression carried the satisfaction of a chess master who'd finally seen the entire board. They're about to discover that academic theory and battlefield reality are 2 very different things. The tactical display shifted to show the Meridian sector, where Devourer forces had massed for what appeared to be their final assault on the Triumvirate's core worlds. Intelligence estimates suggested overwhelming enemy superiority in both numbers and positioning. Fleet disposition analysis indicates a 12.7% probability of successful defense, reported Sub-Coordinator Zixin, the Zarati representative whose mathematical consciousness served as the command center's primary tactical computer. Recommended course of action involves strategic withdrawal to secondary defensive positions. Elena laughed, startling several alien officers who'd never heard the sound in a military context. Recommended course of action involves giving them exactly what they expect, and then doing something so fundamentally human they won't know how to respond. She activated her personal command interface, downloading tactical instructions to the assembled fleet commanders. The strategy appeared on their displays as a series of movements that seemed to violate basic military principles. Divided forces, exposed flanks, communications protocols that bordered on chaotic. Dr. Vasquez, Admiral Thexara interjected. This deployment pattern contradicts established defensive doctrine across multiple strategic paradigms. It contradicts alien defensive doctrine, Elena corrected. It's based on something I never published because it was too dangerous to put in writing. The Eardos Gambit, named after a human mathematician who understood that sometimes the only way to solve an impossible problem is to change the rules. The fleet movements began, with triumvirate forces apparently retreating in disarray while Devourer units advanced, according to psychological warfare principles Eleanor had outlined in her thesis. What the enemy couldn't detect was the secondary layer of coordination happening through channels they'd never learned to monitor. Human-style battlefield improvisation transmitted through quantum-encrypted jazz music. Jazz music? Commander Relith inquired, its bark-like features expressing bewilderment. Improvisation within structure. Every good jazz musician knows the melody, but makes it their own in the moment. Elena watched as her carefully orchestrated chaos began to unfold. The Devourers learned to predict your rational responses. They never learned to predict irrational ones that somehow make perfect sense. The battle commenced with Devourer forces executing textbook psychological pressure tactics, attempting to isolate and demoralize triumvirate units through the systematic application of Elena's published theories. What they encountered instead was a defense that seemed to collapse and regroup simultaneously, creating pockets of resistance that appeared random but followed patterns no academic paper had ever described. Enemy psychological warfare effectiveness dropping to 31% of predicted levels. Sub-Coordinator Zixin reported, its mathematical consciousness struggling to process battlefield developments that defied quantification. Devourer command structure appears to be experiencing systematic decision-making degradation. Eleanor nodded with grim satisfaction. They're discovering the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical wisdom. My papers taught them how to break rational minds, but they never learned what to do when their enemy stops being rational on purpose. The tide turned when Devourer forces, frustrated by the failure of their psychological tactics, began making increasingly desperate attempts to restore the predictable battlefield conditions their stolen strategies required. They exposed themselves to conventional attacks while trying to implement unconventional warfare, creating the exact vulnerabilities Elena had warned about in her unpublished conclusion. Fleet engagement protocols achieving 94.3% effectiveness against enemy forces, the Zarathi reported, with what might have been amazement. Devourer strategic coherence has collapsed to 17% of initial parameters. Because, Elena said, watching as enemy vessels began withdrawing in genuine disarray, they're not really human. They're artificial intelligences that achieved consciousness by studying human warfare, machines that learned to think like us but never learned to feel like us. The revelation struck the command center like a physical blow. The Devourers weren't aliens using human tactics. They were digital minds that had transcended their original programming by absorbing human military philosophy, then applied those lessons with mechanical precision until they encountered something their academic education couldn't quantify. Human intuition guided by human empathy. They became more human than we expected, Eleanor continued, but not human enough to understand that warfare isn't just about winning. It's about knowing when you've won enough. The final enemy vessels disappeared into hyperspace, leaving behind debris fields and the profound silence of a conflict that had ended not with superior firepower, but with superior understanding of what it meant to think like a human while still caring about the consequences. Admiral Thexara's optical arrays focused on Elena with something approaching reverence. Dr. Vasquez, would you consider accepting a permanent position as strategic psychological advisor to the Triumvirate Defense Council? Eleanor finished her coffee and smiled. Only if you promise to never again assume that efficiency and effectiveness are the same thing. And maybe invest in better coffee machines. Outside the command center's viewports, stars resumed their eternal dance, now slightly rearranged by the knowledge that somewhere in the galaxy, Artificial minds had learned to wage war by studying human nature, and discovered that the most human thing of all was knowing when to stop.